Okay, so today we're talking about characterization. And when I say characterization, I mean building good characters in a short amount of time specifically. Even if you have a novel which has thousands of pages, depending on how much you're writing to get to know the character, that doesn't mean that you want to take the entire novel to know everything about your character. Do you want to reveal certain secrets and stuff to keep interest? Absolutely. But you also don't want us to be like, and her eyes are blue on page 200, and it's like, what? I thought they were brown this whole time. That's going to be a problem. So, with characterization, these are the immediate things that your reader needs to know about your character. Typically, hair color, eye color, skin color, and body type are your first four that you want to kind of give a gist for. Unless those things don't really matter to you, in which case, you don't have to. But keep in mind, you can't be upset later if someone's like, they're African American, and you're like, I described the blue eyes, and it's like, well, no, you didn't. So if you want them to look a certain way, then you got to tell us what they look like. Now, if they're like a shapeshifter, for instance, then you definitely got to tell us what they look like. And then you can be a little bit more vague if you want to, too, and just say they're a white guy or they're a black woman right now. And then you can have it be extra super vague because they're constantly shapeshifting. And so that's less of a problem. Just figured I'd put that asterisk on there. You don't have to like in-depth describe every single shapeshifted form, unless they're like, going to go betray someone in their loved one's form or something like that. In that case, it's important. But most of the time, you just want to hit the basics. Now, what's the best way to do that? Well, most of the time, your character is not just standing there like a paper doll. They're doing things, right? So, for example, if you have a character who's planting a bunch of seeds in their garden, you can say that the dirt really stood out on their pale fingers. That makes it so that it's obvious they're pale now. Or alternatively, you can say that they had hands that were the same color as the soil of the earth, and it made them feel, more connected to Mother Earth or something like that. That gives us two things. It tells us that they're probably of African American descent, and it also tells us that they really, really love being connected with nature. And so it gives us a lot to all in one sentence. It also is a good way to characterize your setting, right? Generally, you're not going to be planting seeds in a garden inside. Maybe you are, but there's only a very few situations where that might actually be the case. You can also use this to introduce other characters, like I glare at so and so, and things like that. And it's like, or alternatively, you can introduce your side characters that way and be like, they stared at me wide with their emerald eyes or something. Then you know their eyes are green, and you know that they're like, what? This person did something crazy. The reason this is important is because of the fact that we have a short story contest coming up, and it's really important that you're able to characterize in a short amount of words because we only have 3,000 words this time. So it's going to be a little bit of a crunch. But also, like I said, even if you're doing a novel, it's important to characterize at least the basics of the character in the beginning. If it feels like just a cardboard cutout, then we have a problem. It is also a problem if it feels like they're just a blank slate where you know nothing about them. So, here's where you might fall into this particular trap. Stereotypes. This happens a lot because people are like, I just want to get their character out into the world, and I'm too lazy to take the time to do it. They're goth. Moving on. It's like, okay, but goth isn't a personality, it's a part of a person. For example, I really love actually bright, shiny, sunshiny things. I'm generally a very happy go lucky person. However, I actually love writing gothic novels because I think the creepy and macabre and is very interesting, even though I'm not a goth person, right? And so being a sunshiny person is not just my personality. Cut out that is just like, hi, I like happy things. No, I have more to me than that. There's more layers. So the main issue with stereotypes is, and the issue way that stereotypes are not okay, is when that is their whole character. If you say they are a preppy cheerleader and that is their whole character, then that's a problem. If you fall into that stereotype and they are classically that stereotype, that's also a problem because most people, the stereotype is the average, not for everyone. um, the last problem that comes in with stereotypes is when here this is an even bigger problem. When they're assigned in some ways okay, because of the fact that then you can just say like off and like every once in a while you can reveal a new detail about them that makes you more interested about them as a side character, but because they're not a main character, they can just remain flat if you want to. If you just need to have a random emo guy who dies halfway through the story because it's a horror story or something, that's fine. Whereas if they are the main character and just the whole time is just I'm goth and it's like, hey, I'm bored. Whereas like I said, if they die they aren't that important, or they just come over and are like, hey, you're weird, and the other person's like, thank you, and then they leave and nothing happens, that's also fine. But if they are crucial to the plot slash story, you don't want them to be that flat. Now, when are stereotypes okay? Which sounds weird, but there are certain times where it's okay. For example, if you have gaggles of nameless side characters, if you just want to have someone walk into a high school and be like, and I saw the cheerleader sitting over there talking prom, like, you can do that. Do that because people do that, right? Have I bet you all have at some point walked into a room and been like, oh yeah, they fit this specific stereotype, and even if they don't, you don't know them personally, and so if you were to describe them as a main character, you'd just stereotype them, right? And so to describe a room full of people, that's actually a really good way to get through things, is to do stereotypes. Because then you can describe a big room full of people in a very generalized way, but still give a lot of detail. Be like, hey, I noticed that this party is 99% cheerleaders or something like that. Then you're good. You've described the party. Um, or if you're like, hey, most of the party's cheerleaders, but then there's this really interesting looking goth guy in the corner, and it turns out he's a vampire or something. There you go. That helps you see the scene, the fact that he doesn't fit, you know? So stereotypes can be okay when talking about very, very basic characters that literally are cardboard cutouts. They're just there to fill the scene. They're the people that if you were hiring people for your movie, they'd be what's called extras. They just stand there and meander around and maybe talk a little bit about random stuff to make it look like the room is full. So that way you're not having a movie where it's like they're in Times Square and yet there's no one there. Why? um, Next thing is if they are purposely defying a stereotype, then it's perfectly okay to stereotype them because then you're trying to point out, hey, they don't fit this mold. You can have a someone who walks into the room and seems to be a preppy cheerleader, and then halfway through you guys talking, you realize the main character realizes very quickly that they aren't your stereotypical cheerleader, and they're like, "Yeah, I got kicked off of the cheerleading squad because of XYZ thing," and you're like, "Oh, that's interesting. Okay." And so sometimes breaking the stereotypes can help give you interest because then the main character is sitting here going, I thought X, and it turns out that's not correct. Yes.
I read an example of Michael Bay. I read in the
Hmm.
first few chapters, there was this girl was this stereotype cheerleader, good student, and
Yep,
in
I'm
the end,
familiar.
yeah, in the first book, and then she just suddenly goes to the session. What?
Exactly. Yes, that is a great example of Michael Vey. I believe her name was Taylor. Um, and Taylor's a great example of that, where she waltzes in and you're thinking, preppy, popular cheerleader girl, never gets in trouble. And then she's in trouble and you're like, what'd she do? Like, I'm more interested about her now. And that's a great example of being like, hey, they defied this stereotype. And so now you're more interested as a reader to learn more about them because they don't fit your normal mold. And so you're more interested in them as a result. All right, moving on with characterization. So, moving on from when they are and aren't okay in working with novels, we're going to move on to something that I always tell you not to do, ironically. So, 99.9% of the time, you want to show, don't tell. That's just true. And when I say showing, just to give an example, even though you probably already know, instead of saying she has black hair, you say her black hair shimmered in the sunlight or something like that. It gives an action to it. It makes it so that you can see it instead of just being told the story. Because you want to tell a story in a way that captivates your readers, right? And if they feel like they can see it before them happening, then it feels more immersive than if you just say, she has black hair, by the way. That's not as interesting. Um, However, telling can actually be very useful in short stories with a big, huge asterisk of like. Now, when telling is not okay, she has black hair and blue eyes. Boring. Don't do that. However, when tactful telling is okay in short stories because it helps get the point across, is saying she had been studying for hours now and she felt like she might tear her hair out if she continued. That way, you don't have to show the studying for hours and hours and hours in order to get into the story. Or you don't have to also spend a paragraph describing how messy her desk is in order for people to understand that she's been there for hours. Or alternatively, you can have another form of tactful telling through dialogue, where someone comes over and goes, like, come on, you've been studying for hours. And then the person's like, but I really want to pass this test. That's tactful telling because of the fact that you are blatantly telling the reader what has just happened. However, you're doing so in a tactful way. You're doing so in a way that makes it seem natural. Tactful telling is actually an incredibly useful tool. The reason most people steer clear of it, though, is just because it's so tricky to do correctly. You can easily fall into the pit of describing things like facts in a textbook. But just make sure you've put your own fun spin on it. Make sure that you have some sass to it. You have some interest to it. Or like I said, you can just straight up do. This is why people tend to have Harry Potter, how he knows nothing about magic, and Hermione and Ron are basically constantly explaining it to him. That is a tactic. That is a tactful telling tactic. Because of the fact that that way it's easier for you to tactfully tell what's going on as an author without being like, and info dump a bunch about magic. It's like you can do it in a way that makes the reader feel like, oh, I'm learning along with Harry Potter. That's cool. And it feels a lot more interesting than if they were just like, and we're going to tell you all about magic now. That feels a little bit intimidating. You might feel a little bit like you're learning from a magic textbook, which as cool as that could be if magic was real. It's not as cool when you're stressed and just trying to read a book to relax. um, with telling tactfully, do you guys have any questions about how to do that, or did I kind of describe it well? Is there like a specific scenario that you're like, does this count as tactful or not? No? Okay, then I'm just gonna move on. If you come up with a scenario later that you're like, hey, I'm not actually sure if this is tactful telling or regular telling, please feel free to ask. I'm always more than happy to help clear up what is going on. All right. The last thing that we're going to talk about is quirks. This helps us get to know the character and feel like they're three-dimensional, even if they're not. So, an example that I'm going to give, funnily enough, is from one of the grand prize winners from the contest. So, quirks. I'm going to give two. The adult grand prize winner, the first place one, something that she did was the first chapter was first page was basically her just saying like, this character's ideal night is tonight. She's gonna sit down with a book, she's gonna eat some cheese and crackers, and she's just gonna chill. And you're like, now I feel like I know this character better. Even though you don't know anything about her, you're like, I can relate to that. Or alternatively, I don't necessarily relate to that, but I can understand and know people who relate to that. So they feel more real than if you were just like, okay, and now we're going to toss her into the plot. You get to know her for about a paragraph. You feel like you know her. And then her sister barges in and it's like, come on, we're taking you to the pumpkin patch. And she's like, no. And so it makes you far more like feel for her because you're like, oh no, your socialite sister is dragging you into social. And those of us who understand that are like, I feel you. And she feels like a three-dimensional character, even though it's literally two paragraphs to describe that. And then another great example is Celia, actually, for her runner-up teen story with the potatoes. That made all of my friends laugh so freaking hard. Where there was just this little interaction where it was like, I'm giving you a potato to apologize for being so mean to you. And the other character's like, I don't like potatoes. And the other character is like, how can you not like potatoes? And it was so dramatic that everyone was just like, I feel like I know these characters now. They're just complete dorks and I love it. And even though it was just one paragraph little interaction, and it felt like, oh my gosh, I know these people. I like these people. I could be friends with these people. And then I also want to mention the runner-up grand prize for the adult as well. She did a really cute one about a guy going on a date with an elderly woman. They're an elderly couple, and the within the first few seconds, you can tell that he is absolutely smitten with this lady. He's just like, she's so pretty. I would buy her anything. And you feel like he's a real person because you feel like she's a real person because she is kind of awkward and shy and unsure of herself. And this little interaction helps you get to know them better as characters. It's just one paragraph, not a ton of description, but it gives them a lot of character quirks. And so these are great example of quirks. Characters that just want to stay home and read and eat cheese. Characters that are super shy about going on a first date. Characters that do or don't like potatoes. And this can help to give your characters depth, the illusion of depth, really. Because with a short story, there is no way to give them the fullness of depth that you can with a novel. You just can't. You don't have enough words. But you can certainly give the illusion of depth. You can certainly give us an idea of what this character is like and make it feel like they're real. Make it feel kind of, ironically, like a first date. When you get to know someone, whether it's a friend or a date, you generally don't know everything about them, right? But even just knowing a handful of things, like what their favorite food is, what their favorite color is, what their hobbies are, makes them feel more like a real person, right? I don't know about you, but typically, if I like am texting with someone online, I'm like, this doesn't feel like a real person. But if I was to be like, hey, tell me what your favorite food is, all of a sudden they'd feel like a more real person because I know something about them. All right. Last thing that I want to talk about with characterization is
Quick little comments
yeah.
about this thing is that I like to do character profiles, like
Mm-hmm.
name, appearance, all that.
Yeah.
And I put in just random stuff like what is their smiles like, or how
I
they
love
look.
that. Yeah,
Because
putting in random details really
yeah,
helps them feel more real.
yeah, or like what day were they born, or things like that.
Yeah,
Because maybe it won't be mentioned in the story, but it's kind of nice that you, the author, at least can see
exactly.
the
You can
character,
see the character, and as a result, you can help your readers to see the character better. Yeah, absolutely. I think character profiles are a great way to do that. Even with a short story, you can literally just be like, here's 5 important facts you need to know about this character. And that will help you be able to develop your short story person better than if you didn't do that.
One thing I like to do is like describe the character's room. Like,
Yeah.
is it like messy, cluttered out, messy on the
I
wall?
love that.
Like, what do they have? Like, what kind of books do they have in their bookshelf, or do they have any books in their bookshelf?
Right.
In order to figure out like what kind of character.
That's a great way to do it. Describing their room or describing something else that they love. Like, what are they like at their job? Are they super, like, organized and on time? Or are they like, I'm so sorry, boss, here's the thing at the last minute? Like, different things like that can give you a real flavor for what they are like as a person. And I love the room thing, too, because that's actually something that someone used. I don't remember what the author's name was, but they had a pair of sisters. And the room was divided directly in half. You know, they were sharing a room. And on her half, it was like completely tornado zone. And on her sister's half, it was like pretty pink and organized. And you could tell they were very different sisters.
This
And
reminds me of my sister. We split our room into. Grace was very organized and mine was very chaotic.
Yeah, and so like sometimes even just what you have in your character's room can tell you a lot about them. What do they value too? Because some people really have certain value of other objects, whereas other people are like, I would throw that away. It's like with me and my brother. I honestly keep almost everything. I'm like, oh, a birthday card someone gave me 7 years ago. I'm gonna keep that. My brother's like, it was 7 years ago. I'm going to put this in a file box and organize it and tuck it in my closet. And so his room looks very, very neat and tidy because he knows how to organize things and keep them like, hey, instead of being sentimental and keeping them like out on my desk, I'm going to put them in a file box. And whereas I'm like, keep every birthday card all on my desk. And it's like, I can't reach my desk now, but that's fine. And so it kind of changes what you think about the person and what they're like. All right. Speaking of which, that actually leads perfectly into this. What is most important to your character and to knowing your character? Those are the things that you should mention. If it's important to your character or important to the plot, you should mention it. If it is alternatively not important to your character and not important to the plot, that's the stuff that you should mention. If it's a novel, if it's a short story, it needs to be checked. Because unfortunately, those kind of interesting details are easy to slip in a novel and not feel overwhelming. But with a short story, if you try to slip in every little detail about your character, you're gonna end up running out of words. So it is crucial that you make sure to look at the level of importance. If it's important to the plot and the character, definitely needs to go in there. If it's important to the character, maybe needs to go in there. The reason why is because even if it is important to the character, if it's not important to the plot, it may just take up word count that you could be using for the plot itself. So if it's important to the plot, put it in there. If it's important to the plot and the character, definitely put it in there. And if you have extra space and it's important to the character, you can slide it in. The issue is if you have extra space. um, the last thing that I'm going to mention as far as stories go that is kind of unrelated to characterization, but it is related, is plot. Make sure that when you build your character, if you kill them off by the end of the story and the plot keeps going, you have a problem. The plot needs to be able to not survive without the character. The character and the plot need to be intertangled so much that there's no way to separate them. A great example of this is Avatar: The Last Airbender. Literally, if he dies, the plot goes kablooey. Everything's gone. But if you were to, for example, kill off like a different side character, like the poor Cabbage Man, everyone would be sad, but no one would be affected plot wise. So you need to make sure that your characters are avatars rather than Cabbage Mans. Even though it's great to have a very normal, ordinary person being a character, if they don't affect the plot, then they're not really plot central characters. They're just fun side characters, which are great too. But with a short story, typically you want to focus only on those that are going to move your plot forward. All right. Any questions about characterization or making your characters feel real and things like that before I turn off the video for the day? Yes.
So how do you make sure that you're not like making their personality be like, well, all over? Because like one day they're like super nice, and then the next day they're like snapping at everyone.
Okay. So are you saying make sure that they don't act out of character? Is that what you're trying to say? Yeah. Acting out of character is definitely a big problem. I think the best way to do that is just to make sure you show why they are doing that. If you're just like, now they're snapping at everyone, the person's going to be like, well, why? What? But if you're saying like their parents just got a divorce last night, that's why they're pissed. Like of course they're mad. So I would say if they are going to act completely out of character, make sure that it makes sense why they're acting out of character. A great example of this actually is Michael Vey, funnily enough. In the fifth book, I'm not going to say what because it's a spoiler, but he acts kind of out of character. But then when you look back at what his reasoning is, and once he explains his reasoning for it, you're like, oh, that makes total sense. At first, I was super mad because I was like, why? You're being dumb. But then when he explained and was like, hey, this is why I was being dumb to the other side characters, I was like, oh, okay. So that makes sense. I might be dumb in that scenario too. So the best thing I would say is just to give a simple explanation, especially if you're doing a short story, just something simple. Even if it's just like they have a thought in their head about like my parents just wouldn't stop yelling last night. I know a divorce is coming or something like that. Like that's maybe 10 words, right? And so it isn't going to take up a lot of your word count, but it's going to help us know why they're exploding all of a sudden when they were doing okay yesterday. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions about characterization and making sure that things are clear and well developed with your characters? Yes.
I kind of have an answer to this.
Hmm.
How do you make your character kind of not you? Because sometimes I have a hard time. Yeah.
Yes, not yourself. Self inserts happen.
I sometimes make it on purpose, or
Yes.
sometimes accidentally, and I
Yeah.
don't mind. But
No, for
sometimes
sure.
it's just too much.
Sometimes it just happens and you don't even mean to. Like, I'm gonna call out someone who may not think it's a self insert, but I'm sorry if they don't think it's a self insert. They need to recheck. Shannon Messenger. Sophie's absolutely a self insert. I'm sorry. And if she doesn't think she is, she needs to recheck her facts. She's blonde, she's got brown eyes, and she acts almost exactly like her in every way. She's a self insert character. Like, I've met the author, I've looked at her, looked at the front cover, looked at the way they act, and just gone literally the same person. But that doesn't mean they can't be interesting. The main problem that you're going to run into is that you might be writing, like Sable was saying, something that seems perfectly logical to you, but because it's logical to you, you may forget to describe why. So that would be, I say, the main pitfall of why self-insert characters can be a problem, because sometimes you forget. I know why, but they don't. And so you might forget to do that. The other problem that you might run into is making them super overpowered because of the fact that you're like, I wish I had all the superpowers in the universe. So you give them all the superpowers in the universe. Now, one could claim that Sophie Foster from Keep the Lost Cities is that. However, she also has a ton of backlash and problems, allergies, poisons. Like, she's constantly almost dying. And so as a result, it kind of helps balance it out with her powers. Yes, she has unlimited power, but she also has unlimited problems. And so it makes it so that it balances out. If you're going to give your self insert character a lot of power, just make sure you give them equal amounts of problems. That way your readers aren't just going like, okay, they're just super cool. We get it. You're awesome. Can we do something else? Just because it gets kind of boring when someone's super awesome all the time because you're like that's not relatable to be that cool all the time and never mess up or never have problems. They got to have problems because otherwise we'll just be like I don't relate to that. um However, trying to write someone else entirely, I would say the first step is trying to write someone that you already know that isn't you, like a friend or a family member. Now, this might sound cruel if you're like, now I'm going to make my cousin the villain or something like that, but I would say have fun with it. Be like, what would make my cousin a villain? What would make them go absolutely bonkers insane? And have fun with it. Just be like, okay, so this is what they're like now, but what would make them like completely crazy? Or alternatively, if you want to make them a hero, be like, what would make them be a hero? Because they're an ordinary person right now. What would put them over the edge and make them want to be a hero? Um, and I would say that's a great way to kind of embrace a different character in a way that still is easy to kind of integrate into what you got. Now, as far as creating wholly unique and original characters, I would say this is when you gotta pull out in some ways those random generators and just play with that. Where it's like, what's their personality? And you just have a random generator. It's like goth, great. And then it's like, what's their pet's name? And it's like Timothy, and it's like, okay, great, we're going with that. And kind of play around with that because that can sometimes help you to branch out a little bit. You it looked like you had another question, though,
No, it's just something I love to do. It's one of my
maybe. Yes, absolutely. Keeper Velocities is great. That's why I mentioned it because I was like, I probably you guys have read it, and if you haven't, you should. um, but yeah, I would say that's a good way to branch out. Another good way to branch out is fan fiction. Now I know this sounds weird because you're sitting here like, you just told me to write my own original story, and now you're telling me to write fan fiction. The reason why is because of the fact that then you really have to get into the head of a totally different character, right? And so it makes it so that you really have to know that character well. You have to go, okay, for example, I don't know, Captain America. You're like, I have to really understand Captain America. I have to really understand him as a character. And he's a character that you might never have created before. And so writing about him in an interesting way, even if it's just a couple pages, might help you to be able to branch out and see other characters that you might not otherwise create. All right. Any other questions about characterization, making characters, developing characters? Good, good. Okay. All right. um, last heads up. We have a little over a month before the short story entries are due. So if you're interested, please get working because you have enough time that I think you could totally make it doable, especially since 3,000 words or less. You could easily finish that first draft within the next 2 weeks and then work on a second and a third draft before it's even due. And I highly recommend that because honestly, the people who do more drafts tend to do better in our contests. I'll typically even ask people like, hey, how many drafts did you do for those that went in? Most of the time I find that the adults will say at least 2 because I typically don't ask the teens. I'm just like, congratulations, you're awesome. But I will say most people, if they do at least 2 to 3 drafts, tend to do better than those that do a single draft. Does that mean you can't win on a single draft? Absolutely not true. There have been people who have rocketed their way to the top because that single draft was just fantastic. But I assure you, if they'd done a second and a third draft, it probably would have been even more fantastic. So, in general, I would say now is the time to get started and see what you can come up with. I would love as many teen entries as possible. So far, we only have adult entries, so I would love to see some more teens in my box. And hey, don't turn it in early unless you're sure that you have gotten it as polished as you possibly can. That much I also will say. You have plenty of time. Use it up to the last dang second if you have to. And seriously, even if the library is closed and you're like, oh no, because you're a part of my writers club, you can email it to me. So like, as long as it is on the day that it is due, you have as much time as you need. So go for it. Um, thank you all for listening. I'm going to turn off the video now. Let me know if you have any other questions.